there it is. Over to you.
I'd just like to make it clear that I was volunteered. There was some obscure excuse about maybe this had some connection with my PhD, which was written about 100 years ago anyway. So I have no idea what that was about, and I know Aaron hasn't read my PhD. So I would make an appeal. I mean, to anybody who wants to introduce it. It's not. Some people have given some superb introductions. Well, everyone's given superb introductions so far, but I mean, but you know, really worked at them. But it's not, or that's not absolutely necessary. Just a brief introduction, which this will not be, and there's a reason for that. I wonder if I could draw your attention to the first paragraph, where the translation talks about the unity of the three directions of knowledge, which is Logik, Physik, and Ethik, logic, physics, and ethics. And it asks the question where the unity of these three directions of knowledge has its starting point, its principle. Now, the English translation talks about an understanding, but the German is much clearer, and it talks about a Sichverstehens in the first sentence of section 3. The three terms, logic, physics, and ethics, name three manners and directions of a self-understanding. And for those of you who know me well will know that that's something I bang on about continually, that there is no such thing as beings as a whole. There is only being as a whole. We are today in the province of the question of logic. So why am I yet again banging on about the Hemming hobby horse, which is whether there are beings as a whole or being as a whole, whether Das Seiende should be translated as beings or being. Aaron and I have recently been working on a translation where Heidegger makes the point that in both Sanskrit and Greek, the plural for what is present, taonta in Greek, I don't know what it is in Sanskrit, I know no Sanskrit, unfortunately, indicates a singular. And with a very eminent, I won't name him, but somebody I respect enormously, a very eminent Heideggerian that Aaron and I have been talking to recently, is skeptical about my concern for insisting that Das Seiende must be translated with as a singular and not as a plural, thus not as beings. Now, we all know what the problem is here, that if you translate Das Seiende with a singular being, then you have no term for Das Sein. And so therefore you have to resort to these very awkward and even rebarbative English terms, what is, or what is present, or the essence, or l'existant, which is, I think, how Levinas resolved the question, l'étant et l'existant. Das Seiende renders what for Kant was Dasein, was in existence, was existence itself, as it were, was actually present. Why this is important, I hope, will become clear as we look through this section 3. What is the issue that Heidegger wants to bring before us? What is the difference between Logik, logic, and Logos? I said a few weeks ago that many of Heidegger's own lecture courses were entitled Logik. Indeed, one of his most famous was where he was supposed to be lecturing on the Nazi state, and he refused. He stood up and said, Ich lese Logik. I'm going to talk about logic. I'm not talking about politics today. I'm talking about logic. Ich lese Logik. Those of us who had our initial training in philosophy in the analytic tradition will have been drilled in, I mean, my first term was spent in first and second order predicate calculus, a nightmare. Especially if you were rather unprepared for it, as I was at the age of 18, and wondered what on earth I'd landed myself in with existential and universal quantifiers and all the other paraphernalia of predicate calculus, which then went on into modal logic and other forms of symbolic logic. Why does logic sit at the bottom of philosophy in the way it does? In Heidegger's lectures on Leibniz, he actually asks that question in the opening of one section. There's a long disquisition on the irrelevance of the place of traditional or classical logic. As we proceed through section 3, Heidegger raises the question of the place of philosophy, as it were, of the preeminence of philosophy in relation to the sciences. The sciences are presumed, as it were, to be logical. I want to draw attention yet again to that Sichverstehens, auf das Seiende im Ganzen, the self-understanding of being as a whole. Let's ask some questions in opening this up. What does das Seiende im Ganzen mean? Does it have a Hegelian sense of the totality of all that is in being, both past and present and future, which Geist in some sense has access to, both positively and negatively, which is simply a repristinization of the medieval idea that in the mind of God, everything, past, present, and future, and even those things which are not activated. In Aquinas says in the question 3 of the De Veritate, de Ides, a very important question for Heidegger, that everything that could possibly be is in the mind of God as an idea. But there are many ideas in the mind of God that are not activated. So that even the could be or the possibly present is present in the mind of God, even though it's unknown to us. Is this das Seiende im Ganzen? For Hegel, das Seiende im Ganzen, I don't think he ever uses this phrase, but what he means by what he would have meant by it would have been a reference to the infinite. And indeed, he distinguishes between different forms of infinite, the good and the bad infinite. Das Seiende im Ganzen would have been the good infinite, the totality, which would have been coincident with die Lehre vom Sein, the doctrine of being itself. Everything that can be, that has been, that would be, and that possibly could be, is coordinate with what being names, die Lehre vom Sein, the doctrine of being. Is this what Heidegger has in mind? We know that this is not the case. Heidegger is highly critical of Hegel's understanding of being. Das Seiende im Ganzen, therefore, names a present unity, precisely because for Heidegger, das Seiende names the presently present. What is, if you like, actual. He takes that notion of Dasein from Kant and transforms it into the way that Nator, for instance, uses it. And indeed, also Brentano uses it in this way. And I suspect, although I haven't checked, Husserl also uses it in this way. What is immediately present? Why is this important? I hope to touch on this as we go through. Heidegger then talks about the question of how a discipline shapes and orders what we know. You will have read this. I don't intend to explore it too deeply, except that what we are looking for in naming how a discipline works is the most universal, the translation says, the most stringent or the highest science, how we are to bring ourselves into a relationship with this. And then Heidegger says, concealed herein lies a strange fate, namely that since Plato and Aristotle, the thinking called philosophy has failed to return to its own essential grounding in order to receive from it, and only from it, the imprint and secret of its essence. If one wanted to name, if one wanted to encapsulate the whole of Heidegger's outlook in the totality of his work, his entire Im Ganzen, it would be this phrase, this strange fate, namely that since Plato and Aristotle, the thinking called philosophy has failed to return to its own essential grounding in order to receive from it, and only from it, the imprint and secret of its essence. What is the relation of this essential ground to das Seiende im Ganzen? If it is not the Hegelian grounding of something like the medieval order of the mind of God, but now as Geist as the pure concept, the negation of the negation, the concept which is, as it were, without content in the world, but nevertheless which constantly imprints itself through manifesting itself in world. How then is it to be grounded? What is the relationship between this essential ground and the manifest totality that we find ourselves always and already within? It seems to me that this is the question that Heidegger is drawing before us constantly. But the question is not simply thrown at us. The question is offered to us as a path, something which we have to pursue, something which we have to work out. In which order does it stand? What comes before what? Logic historically has seemed to offer a kind of binding character for thinking, such that it directs the direction of that path. It seems to me that's exactly what this initial discussion of the notion of a discipline, of the set of possible questions, and with them directions and ways of possible exploration, is set before us. We know that to a certain extent already in the 19th century, this unity of disciplines is beginning to unravel. We see in the modern university this even more so has come to unravel. It's distrusted. We often hear now, those of us who are doing research are encouraged to be interdisciplinary, not to worry about or respect disciplinary boundaries. There is, as it were, something being named here, that disciplines are exhausted as sets of directions which allow a consistent and positive exploration within a particular field. What then offers itself as a ground, either in any particular discipline or in the discipline of disciplines, namely philosophy? Or do we follow Heidegger and say that we abandon philosophy, or we bring philosophy to an end, the Abbruch of philosophy? We heard him say in last year's the lecture courses that we looked at last year, of philosophy for the sake of thinking. The text that Aaron and I have been looking at recently speaks constantly of a futural or future thinking, ein künftiger Denken, a thinking, as it were, that is on the way, that is yet to be recovered, that is yet to come, in which we have forgotten its manner and its patterns of thinking. It's this, therefore, that offers us the transition from section A of GA 55, section 3 of this second lecture course, to section B. And this is where I really want to focus my remarks before I shut up and let a wider discussion take place. Who is it that appears immediately we make the transition to section B, but Kant? The decisive step in thinking undertaken by Kant, a thinking about whose essence and scope he also possessed a clear knowledge, is the step away from a prior logic towards a new logic that he named transcendental logic. Here, prior logic simply needs to be understood in its historical sense. But as you know, because you'll have prepared the text, I'm quoting directly from the English translation. Kant unleashes a different understanding of logic. what is the issue in either the prior historical logic or the transcendental logic, which Kant says replaces the prior logic? Every manifold can only be a manifold because it already exists in relation to a unity. Similarly, every unity can only be a unity in as much as it is already in a relationship with a manifold. The question is, does the unity come before the manifold, or does the manifold come before the unity, or do they exist in a constant interrelationship? In which case, why is the unity not simply a part of the manifold, and therefore the manifold is nothing other than a manifold, in which case, where and in what and how is its unity grounded? These are the most basic questions that thinking thinks. Kant addresses this in the question of a transcendental logic. Now, Heidegger doesn't explain in section 3 what a transcendental logic is. And therefore, as an opening for today's discussion, I wanted to ask your indulgence. If we look at a different text of Heidegger's, and I'm going to use only the English translation to do this. It's a rather fine translation by James Reed and Ben Crow of a lecture course that was given. It's the lecture course actually that it comes immediately after the Einführung in die Metaphysik lectures, GA 40. This is GA 41, Die Frage nach dem Ding, the question concerning the thing. We aren't going to be able to resolve the Kantian question through and through today, but I wanted to bring simply one thing to the fore, and I want therefore to read some extended passages from Die Frage nach dem Ding, in which there is contained a thoroughgoing and reading of Kant on the question of the transcendental logic, in order to show how this question of unity manifests itself. So at page 158 of GA 41, Heidegger says, the essential definition of judgment comes in section 19 or section B140 of the first critique. The paragraph itself begins with the words, this is Kant speaking, I have never been able to satisfy myself with the explanation that the logicians give of a judgment in general. It is, they say, the representation of a relation between two concepts. Explanation means to make something clear, not to derive something causally. This is Heidegger speaking, what Kant rejects here as insufficient is precisely the definition of Meier, which is to say of Baumgarten and Wolff. These are the two figures who laid down the basics of metaphysical logic. The target is the definition of judgment as assertion, legein ti kata tinos, familiar in logic, the judgment, therefore, of somewhat according to its of what, or its character. Familiar in logic since Aristotle. But Kant does not say this characterization is false, but only that it is unsatisfactory. Kant says, and then Heidegger quotes him, the understanding shows its capacity only in judgments, which are nothing else but the unity of consciousness in relation to concepts as such. We should note that point, the unity of consciousness in relation to concepts as such. Here he's quoting from a small and little known text, What Real Progress Has Metaphysics Made in Germany Since the Time of Leibniz and Wolff? This is, I think it was 1791 or 1793. It's written after the publication of the B version of the first critique. Heidegger continues, where a relation is represented, a unity is always represented that supports the relation and becomes conscious through the relation, so that what is conscious in the judgment has the character of unity. This is a way of, for Heidegger, of phrasing that question that I asked earlier, of what is the relationship between the unity and the manifold. Heidegger continues, Aristotle always gave a voice to the same conception. And then he cites De Anima, section 3, book 3, sorry, section 6. Every judgment contains a synthesis tis idi noimaton hosperchen onton. Always something like a positing together, synthesis. Those of you who know your Kant know that this word is not there by accident. A positing together as a synthesis of representations in a certain unity. Heidegger comments, this characterization of judgment holds of judgment in general. What he means by this, therefore, is that every judgment is a synthesis, and a synthesis of representations in a certain unity. A little later on, Heidegger comments or asks this question, how does Kant's new definition of judgment run? Kant says, and he then quotes Kant, that a judgment is nothing other than the way to bring given cognitions to the objective unity of apperception. Heidegger says we still cannot fully and immediately understand this definition and its individual elements. Meanwhile, something conspicuous strikes the eye. The discourse is no longer about representations and concepts, but of given cognitions, i.e., of the given in cognition, consequently of intuitions. It speaks of objective unity. We should keep in mind these questions about das Seiende and das Seiende im Ganzen, of the relationship of the object or the thing in relation to presence, both its presence as an object or as a thing, and presence as a whole, that objective presence, Dasein, from out of which the object or thing is taken. That's me speaking. A little later, Heidegger comments the various tortured, skewed, and fruitless attempts to cope with Kant's distinction all suffer in advance from the same defect. They rest upon the traditional definition, but not on the definition achieved by Kant. Now, the reason I quote this is because it's a warning. We tend to assume that the discussions that we have, especially and even in the field of logic, are discussions between thinkers. But what Heidegger's trying to draw attention to here is that both he, Heidegger, and Kant are not interested in, as it were, plucking material out, let's say from Wolff or Baumgarten or from Hegel or even from Heidegger, but rather we are interested in pursuing that path right back down to the ground, so that we are no longer interested in the variety of discussions or opinions between individuals. What we must be interested in is what makes itself manifest, the Dasein in the Kantian sense of the Das Seiende in the Heideggerian sense of what makes itself present, what offers itself to us to be understood. How is what offers itself to us to be understood to be understood? It is that how of the to be understood that we're interested in. In this text, GA 55, and in the other texts around this time, Heidegger calls this the Zudenkende. Again, Aaron and I have been struggling over how exactly best to translate that. It's obvious from these remarks here and other remarks that Heidegger makes that Zudenkende is not a thing, but rather it's the manner of how the thing is to be thought. Now you will understand why section A is preoccupied with the way that disciplines predetermine how things are to be thought. Disciplines both organize and order something, but in the ordering and the disciplining, as it were, something also gets lost, which is the originary presenting of what presents itself to be understood in the first place. the science, if you like, this is Heidegger's whole point about scientific inquiry. The science has a tendency to ignore what it cannot understand, and therefore to ignore in that which presents itself, which it does not want to deal with. This is a problem in all science. It's certainly a problem as Heidegger understands it. It wouldn't take us very long to come up with repeated examples of how this happens. Heidegger continues much further on. As general logic, logic disregards every relation to the object. This is a point that Heidegger is drawing from Kant himself. He references the first critique at A55 and B79. He continues, it knows nothing like synthetic judgments, that's general logic. But all metaphysical judgments are synthetic. This is pure Kant. Hence, and this alone is what matters now. Logical principles, none of them is ever any principle of metaphysics. This is a strange comment to make. No logical principle is a principle of metaphysics. This is not because logical principles don't mean anything or they don't work, but they can't themselves be the ground that metaphysics springs from out of. They must be the consequence of something else. That's Kant's most basic point. That's why there is a need to replace historic prior logic, as it were, the way logic used to be done, with transcendental logic. So if logical principles, are not the compelling unity that we are looking for, then the compelling unity that we're out after must be from somewhere else. So the question we have to keep in mind is, where is this compelling unity to be found? And we ask it in two ways. We ask, where does Kant find it? And then we ask, where does Heidegger find it? And how does that relate to Kant's finding of it? So Heidegger continues, hence, and this is the further decisive consequence that mediates between the first and second sections of the first critique. Metaphysical cognition and every objective synthetic cognition in general demands another grounding. This is another way of saying what I've just said. A little further ahead in Die Frage nach dem Ding, Heidegger notes, the transcendental is what concerns transcendence. Viewed transcendentally, thought is considered in its crossing over, hinübersteigen, to the object. Transcendental reflection is not directed toward objects themselves, nor toward thought as mere representation of the subject-predicate relation, but toward this crossing over, Überstieg, and the relation to the object as this relation. This is the very thing that Heidegger is naming as the Zudenkende, which we saw in the first of the lecture courses in the last semester. Let me end, therefore, on these two comments of Heidegger's. This is all Heidegger. The explanation of the possibility of synthetic judgments is a problem with which general logic has nothing to do, indeed whose name it need not even know. But in a transcendental logic, it is the most important business of all, and indeed the only business if the issue is the possibility of synthetic judgments a priori, and likewise the conditions and domain of their validity. For by completing this task, transcendental logic can fully satisfy its goal of determining the domain and boundaries of pure understanding. In the analytic judgment, I remain with the given concept in order to discern something about it. This is Kant. If it is an affirmative judgment, I only ascribe to this concept that which is already thought in it. If it is a negative judgment, I only exclude the opposite of this concept from it. In synthetic judgments, however, I am to go beyond the given concept in order to consider something entirely different from what is thought in it, as in a relation to it. a relation which is therefore never one of either identity or contradiction, and one where neither the truth nor even the error of the judgment can be seen in the judgment itself. That is a quotation from the first critique. All Kant is doing in this is he's asserting the presence of the present thing to be perceived. In other words, he's drawing our attention to the way that judgments are about something. They are about ein sein des, that which presents itself before us. Heidegger continues, that which is entirely different, this quote from Kant, is the object. The relation of that which is entirely different to the concept makes the object available, beistellen, representationally, in a thinking intuition, a synthesis. An object only encounters us when we enter into this relation and remain in it. The inner possibility of the object, i.e. its essence, is therefore co-determined by the possibility of this relation to it. Heidegger then asks, in what does this relation to the object consist? In what is it grounded? The ground upon which it rests must be exposed and posited properly as ground. This occurs in the establishment and justification of the supreme principle of all synthetic judgments. Please keep in mind, in hearing what is said here, the very first paragraph of section 3, which talks both about a unity and principles and a Sichverstehen, a self-understanding. And a Sichverstehen is that understanding which cannot be got out from under. It understands itself because it's also a Selbstverständnis, a self-evidence. So Heidegger continues, the condition of the possibility of all truth is grounded in this posited ground. The principles of pure understanding are the source of all truth. So now we know why we're asking the question about the difference between logic and logos. It's because what is at issue is aletheia, the source of all truth. So Heidegger continues, the principles themselves, and hence this source of all truth, lead back to a deeper source that is brought to light in the supreme principle of all synthetic judgments. The entire critique of pure reason reaches its deepest self-laid ground in the second section of our chapter. This is the chapter that I'm quoting from in Die Frage nach dem Ding. The supreme principle of all synthetic judgments, or as we could also say, the original determination of human cognition, its truth and its object, is formulated at the end of the second section. And then Heidegger quotes Kant. The conditions of the possibility of experience in general are at the same time conditions of the possibility of the objects of experience. Heidegger says, whoever understands this sentence understands Kant's critique of pure reason. Whoever understands this not only knows one book in the philosophical literature, but masters a basic position of our historical Dasein, which we can neither skirt nor overleap nor otherwise disown. But we must settle the matter in the future in an appropriating transformation. To that end, the first section provides the key. And then he quotes Kant. That there are principles anywhere at all is to be ascribed solely to the pure understanding, which is not only the faculty of rules in regard to that which happens, but is rather itself the source of the principles in accordance with which everything that can even come before us as an object necessarily stands under rules, since without such rules, appearances could never amount to cognition of an object corresponding to them. So the object must correspond to a set of rules. This is the transcendental logic. Where does it come from? On what is it grounded? And Heidegger, and this is where I will end, Heidegger then proceeds. In accordance with its metaphysical origin, The pure understanding is the source of principles. The pure understanding. The pure understanding of whom or what? The pure understanding of the subjectivity of the subject. Heidegger continues, these principles are in turn the source of all truth, i.e. the possibility that our experiences are able in general to correspond with objects. Such correspondence with X is only possible if the with which, womit in the German, of the correspondence already comes before us in advance and stands before us. Only in this way does something objective address us in the appearance. Only in this way does it become knowable with respect to an object that speaks in them and corresponds to them. The pure understanding furnishes the possibility of correspondence with the object, thanks to the objectivity of appearance, i.e. the thingness of the thing for us. Now, there's an awful lot more to be said, but I've gone on far too long already, but I wanted us to explore in full what Heidegger means when he starts to quote Kant's transcendental logic, because although he references it repeatedly in section B and in the Wiederholung, he doesn't explain it. So this at least doesn't explain it in full, but gives us an insight. The unity, therefore, of the manifold is given in the subjectivity of the subject. And that is what the transcendental logic means. And it is that we are going to set against what Heraclitus says. And we need to set it against what Heraclitus will say about the Logos in two ways. The Logos will have to show on what basis Kant's understanding of this unity arose. And it will then have to show how we are to understand an even more originary basis than the one that Kant posits. And on that note, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence.